Welcome to the REBT Advocates. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein, and I usually do this with my partner, Tommy Bateman, but he's away, so it'll just be me and our guest. And we're very fortunate to have with us today Dr. Warren Farrell. Dr. Farrell is the author of many books, some of them New York Times bestsellers, including Why Men Are the Way They Are and The Myth of Male Power. So welcome to our podcast, Warren.
Michael, I'm really enjoying doing our first session together in maybe a half a century of our knowing each other.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you here. And before we start discussing your latest book, The Boy Crisis, I just wanted to ask you, since the REBT Advocates is devoted to the work of Albert Ellis, about Al. You knew Al personally, and were there one or two things that struck you about Dr. Ellis?
Well, I remember, I think Albert considered me one of his best friends, or at least he said that to me. And once my former wife and I asked him to join us for a vacation if he wished to. And he said, if there is anyone with whom I would like to go on a vacation, it would be you and your wife. However, I would prefer to be at home writing the gospel according to Albert. And that sort of gave you, I think that was after he had written only about 30 books. And he was, he would go on to write many more books after that. And so he was very prolific, extremely dedicated, and believed that, that what he was doing, he was one of the men of great purpose, really feeling that what he was doing was helping many people move through being a prisoner of emotions that they couldn't think through and decide what was in their best interest in a rational way.
Yeah, that's a great memory. Thanks for that, Warren. Okay, Warren Farrell is the author with John Gray of The Boy Crisis. And just to give my brief review, it's a very impressive, comprehensive work. It addresses many aspects of the problem that boys have growing up these days, and it includes a variety of bodies of knowledge. It includes politics, sociology, philosophy, law, ethics, economics, and of course, psychology. I probably left a few out, but I highly recommend it to you, and I think you'll enjoy it and learn a lot from it. So, Warren, would you want to start by just giving us a short summary of what you presented in the book?
Sure. I think one of the things that surprised me the most, that really motivated me to write the book, was finding that in all 56 developed nations, boys were falling significantly behind girls in every single academic subject, and especially in reading and writing, which are the two biggest predictors of success. And so I started asking myself, what do developed nations have in common? And so I saw that what they had in common was that once a nation became developed, it gave more permission for there to be divorces, and gave more permission for women to have be single mothers without being to have children without being married. And just to give you a perspective on that last part, women in the United States today who are under 30 who have children, 53% of them have children without being married. And so not all these children, and so I started then looking more carefully at the group who was divorced and the group that had children without being married. And I found that the boy crisis resides where dads do not reside. That is, when there was a divorce and the children had both parents about equally, and there was no bad mouthing, and the parents lived near each other, and the parents went to couples communication counseling. When they had those 4 must-dos, there wasn't a huge problem. But if any of those must-dos were not available to the children, if the mother was with the father more than the father was with the mother, if it was like one of the every other weekend type of arrangements, those boys and girls were having significant problems in more than 70 different areas, which just shocked me. The only difference between the boys and the girls is that the boys' problems were much more intense, much more significant. They were far more likely, boys who did not have fathers were far more likely to commit suicide, or who had minimal father involvement. They were far more likely to be depressed. They were far more likely to drop out of school, to be rebellious in school, to be unemployed in their 20s, and so on. So then I looked over in the children of the women who had children without being married, and found that usually for the first 1, 2, or 3 years, the father and the mother were involved, and we don't have great data on what was happening there. But we did find out that 40% of the children who were born to mothers who were not married, 40% of them had minimal or no contact with their fathers after 4 years. And it was in that group of children, of mothers who were not married when they had the children, that the boys were having significant problems. Girls also, but again, boys more intensely. And so I started to then ask the question, why are fathers so important? And are they, and what do they do that's different from what moms do? And, how can we create the best outcomes for children? And that led to the boy crisis.
Okay, very good. And that certainly is a theme throughout the book. One question I had about that, Warren, was as we know, personality is an interaction not only between upbringing, but also genetics. So what part would you say, as an estimate, of the boy crisis comes from absent dads or dads not involved with the boy and the genetics? Because you could make a case that if the father is disturbed, he's more likely to have a poor marriage and get divorced, and the son will get his disturbed genes, so that'll be an influence on his personality. And then, as you're pointing out, the lack of a dad may be also another influence, sometimes negative, but I think there's a case to be made that it might be positive, actually. But so the question is the interaction between genetics and environment in terms of the boy crisis.
Yeah, there certainly could be that connection as well. The only thing that we know for sure, and one of the things that I always say with genetics, versus social construction of gender, is that it's probably 70 and 70, meaning that it's about 70% genetics, 70% social construction. And it's not that I'm bad at math, but rather that that we have in our brain the RCZ, the rostral cingulate zone, and that RCZ, that rostral cingulate zone, gives us dopamine when we get social approval. So part of our biology is designed to reflect a desire to adapt to whatever is giving us social approval. So therefore, what is biological and what is social is not really separable. They're very, very interactive. And we see this on a different level with boys and girls who are aged 9.5. Scientists discovered that when you're about 9.5 years of age, the length of your telomeres, that is the part of your cells that contain your genetic triggers for possibly having a longer life expectancy via being able to prevent against heart disease, cancer, or whatever is the genetic problems in your family, that when you are 9.5 years old, the length of your telomeres, the longer your telomeres are, the longer you're likely to have a life expectancy that's longer. And so they measured, they looked for many, many variables of children, and they controlled for many variables like mental disturbance, the types of things that you were talking about. And they found that the single most important variable at the age of 9.5 was whether the children had father involvement or did not have father involvement. And they found that if the children did not have minimal or no father involvement, the telomeres were on average 14% shorter, predicting an approximately 14% shorter life expectancy. However, they also found that the boys who didn't have father involvement their telomeres were yet again 40% shorter than their sisters' telomeres. So the vulnerability of both boys and girls was significant to lack of father involvement, but the vulnerability of boys to lack of father involvement was on this level, on this measure, about 40% greater than the girls. And that's sort of both true scientifically, but also I found it to be a metaphor for for the vulnerability of both boys and girls without fathers, but the relatively greater vulnerability of boys compared to girls. One of I think the findings in the boy crisis that really surprised me the most was seeing over and over again how boys were so vulnerable when there was social disconnection. When boys and girls, when the Department of Housing and Urban Development moved both entire families to a new neighborhood with a much better neighborhood on an economic level, under the expectation that they would give them more opportunities to succeed in schools that were ranked more highly in neighborhoods that were more economically prosperous. In fact, the Department of Housing and Urban Development's prediction was very accurate for girls. The girls did much better in the new neighborhoods. The boys, though, did significantly worse. That the smaller amount of emotional intelligence and social skills that boys receive as part of masculinity led to them having worse opportunities to adjust. And that was especially if they did not have dads in their homes. And these groups, by and large, that came from poor neighborhoods, did not have a significant amount of father involvement. The vulnerability was there for the boys to a much greater degree than it was there for the girls.
Right. And that also could be influenced, even telomeres could be influenced by genetics plus environment. Isn't that the case?
Yes, absolutely. I think everything is influenced by a combination of genetics plus environment. There are boys like President Clinton and President Obama who suffered in relation to lack of father involvement that overcame that to become very successful. Now, they may be insecure on the inside. President Obama has often stated in his book on fathers that there was always a hole in his heart in relation to the lack of his father's direct involvement, even though he had very good involvement from his grandfather and grandmother. And certainly one can, doesn't have to be a very careful observer of psychology to see the insecurities inside of President Clinton. But both of them are extraordinary men who overcame the background of minimal or no father involvement. And you see this a lot in biographies. When you read biographies of famous people, there are oftentimes people that came from very rough and tumble and difficult backgrounds, and they're the 1 in 100,000 that survived that process and got to the top. But if they did that, they were usually exceptionally strong swimmers, so to speak. But on the other hand, for each one that gets to the top, there's another 999 that sink in the process. And of course, we want to create a world where our children are able to have the best opportunities possible. And one of the things that was so impressive about the difference in the research that I did on this topic when I wrote a book previously in the year 2001 called Father and Child Reunion, there was a fair amount of data available showing the importance of fathers. But by 2018, when I did the Boy Crisis book, the data was much more sophisticated. It had controlled for dozens and dozens of variables, socioeconomic variables, psychological health variables, and so on. And the data was so impressive that a fellow named Richard Warshak, who's a famous psychologist, got 100 researchers and psychologists, clinical psychologists and researchers, to look at the data on father involvement versus lack of father involvement and controlling for all the variables. These 100 researchers and psychologists came out with a consensus report. And this consensus report says when all the variables are measured and compared with each other, what we see is that children of divorce who have minimal or no father involvement, less than 40% father involvement, they are significantly more likely to suffer in a whole series of ways. And I found in the research for the Boy Crisis that those whole series of ways amounted ultimately to 70 different ways. We see this in just everyday life. So for example, when the next time there's a mass shooter, just look at the background of the mass shooter. And on a 90% level, what I have found looking at the mass shooters post-Columbine is that about 90% of the mass shooters were boys who were dad-deprived boys. And we can say, so for example, with Stephen Paddock in Las Vegas, there was, the dad was absolutely brilliant, brilliant enough to be able to escape from prison. And then he was put in another prison. He escaped from prison again. And then he was put into a maximum security prison. But he had lived out his term and he had only 2 or 3 months to go before he would be released from that prison. And his son, Stephen Paddock, was just very much looking forward to his coming home, according to the mother and all the family and friends that were interviewed. But instead of coming home and waiting out his term, Stephen Paddock's dad decided to escape from the maximum security prison. And Stephen apparently was devastated the fact that his father would choose to escape from prison and not come home and not be with him. And Stephen Paddock then put together a demonic, with his own demonic brilliance and genius, he put together the largest mass shooting in history, killing in Las Vegas 58 people at a concert, and also injuring over 590 people at that concert. And from what I was able to gather from the interviews that were done by other people, was that basically Stephen was saying, Dad, I want your attention. I need you. I'm as brilliant as you are. I'm just like you. I'm your son. You're a genius. You escaped the maximum security prison. I'm also a genius. Pay attention to me. Be with me. I am going to show you that I am worthy of your attention. And that is sort of an example of the plea behind so many boys without dads. They feel abandoned, that they don't know who they are. In the old days, it used to be that boys had a sense of purpose. They knew that every generation had its war. And the parents of every generation encouraged their boys, if they were at all prone in this direction, to be part of the military, to be part of the war, and that they would be called heroes. But these days, there are many fewer wars with a need for many fewer boys. And boys don't need to be the sole breadwinner like they used to be in the old days automatically. And so the bad news is that the boys now have a purpose void. The good news is that they have an opportunity for a much broader, less restricted sense of purpose that is less dependent upon being disposable, like disposable in war or disposable in the hazardous jobs in the workplace. But if you have both a purpose void and a dad void, what I found in doing the research for the boy crisis is when those two voids coexist, the purpose void and the dad void, the boy has all this testosterone, no sense of purpose, and he doesn't have the postponed gratification, the boundary enforcement, the discipline that dads tend to bring to the parenting process to be able to find a new sense of purpose and then achieve his dream. Now, he usually finds a new sense of purpose from his mom, who is oftentimes, as a single mom, very encouraging of the boy's sensitivities and the boy's dreams. But what I discovered in the research for the boy crisis is when the boy is sensitive to his dreams, but he doesn't have the discipline to be able to fulfill his dreams. He tries 1, 2, or 3 dreams out. He fails, and then he begins to be afraid to dream. Then he becomes ashamed of himself for not living up to what his mother says is the best in him and that he can do. And so he starts withdrawing into video games, becoming often video game addicted. Or when it comes to boy-girl time, he sees that girls are not interested in dating losers. They want to date winners. And so he feels like he's constantly being rejected. So he turns to porn, because porn is access to a variety of attractive women without fear of rejection at a price that he can afford. And so he oftentimes begins to withdraw, and he falls down this slippery slope into the boy crisis. And in the worst case scenarios, when he perceives of himself as a loser, but his mom is saying he's sensitive and bright, but nobody at school is recognizing him as this, as sensitive and bright, and he's rejected. He can sometimes become deeply angry and become an ISIS recruit, a mass shooter, or with that anger commit crimes. And so we see the same basic percentages among prisoners, mass shooters, and ISIS recruits
Well,
are,
Warren.
are all about 90% dad deprived.
Yep. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt. So we can't really go back and change someone's genes. All we as psychologists can work with is the person themselves.
Yes.
And so I was wondering what you thought about some of the strategies that I try to use in working with boys and parents in helping raise their boys. And one is I teach them the problem separation technique, which means we have practical problems going through life. And if your father is absent and you want to have a positive male role model in your house, that's a practical problem. But then you may create emotional problems about it, which you're indicating boys easily do. You could feel stressed about it. You could feel less of a person. You could get depressed about not having a father around, those kinds of things. So what I try to do is teach people how to identify the underlying thinking that's causing their emotional problem and teach them how to change that. So is that one of the strategies you would use also?
I think that's a very intelligent strategy because it teaches a boy to take charge of himself and it challenges the boy. Boys respond very well to being challenged, and they respond very well to encouragement to overcome barriers. And so if they have a technique and a way of doing that, and they begin to feel some success at that technique, they can begin to feel in charge of their lives and in charge of their futures. It is also important to get, so you become an extremely effective potential mentor for that boy. And it's also important to encourage that boy to have other mentors, but also one of the things I discovered in doing the research for the boy crisis is that it's not only important for a boy to have mentors and therapists like you that challenge him to try something different than he is emotionally prone to slip into. But it is also important for him for you to work with him to find somebody to mentor. Maybe somebody who can't afford to go to a good therapist like yourself, who needs the encouragement of the boy that you're working with, and the impact is likely to be positive for the boy that the boy that you're working with is working with, but it's also more likely to be extremely positive for the boy you're working with because what we found is that boys who are mentors, every behavior that they do. So when you encourage them to make a separation, and they are being able to do that and be successful, they're proud of themselves, not only for themselves, but for the way they appear as a successful role model for the boy that they're mentoring. And so everything that they are tempted to do, whether it's being tempted to study for a test or play respond to a text or play a video game instead, they start saying to themselves, okay, I can be in charge of this per your encouragement, and I can also show the boy that I'm mentoring that I'm in charge of this, and this is how I learned how to do it in therapy, and this is how you can learn how to do it. And he doesn't want to give into the immediate gratification because he wants to be a model for this boy that he's mentoring.
So the mentor would largely be a peer rather than an adult. Is that what you're saying?
A younger peer, and not a peer, but like maybe 2 or 3 years younger, a boy maybe who's in a poor neighborhood, who's having problems.
So he would mentor a younger boy, or he would find a mentor for himself who's somewhat older, but also not an adult. Is that the idea?
Well, yes, there's 3 solutions. One is somebody like yourself who is, skilled at being able to help phenomenon like, the boy to be able to do separation of emotions from, and, take charge of what he needs to take charge of and have that strength and power, which is very much male. That is, males are very receptive to that type of challenge, to go above and beyond being controlled by emotions that are dysfunctional for them, but they need the guidance to do that. So there's 3 levels here. One is the level of you, the professional. Another is the level of a mentor who's not a professional, and the third, the second most important of those, we don't really know between, is to be a mentor to somebody younger than he is, who needs help, that's falling behind, that's underachieving.
Right, right. Okay, very good. And then another strategy I suggest to the family to do something I call a regularly scheduled family discussion, where on a regular basis, usually once a week, the family gets together and discusses positive things that went on during the week, and then brings up some problems that they'd like to work on in a mutually supportive way. So I think that's useful also.
I would have 3 comments on that. 1 is I agree, 2 is I agree, and 3 is I agree.
Okay.
I would add a couple of things to that. The family dinner nights have, for quite a while now, been correlated with children doing much better and feeling much more secure. However, some family dinner nights, as I'm sure you would agree, become family dinner nightmares. And so I found this to be true so often that I ended up creating an appendix in my book totally devoted to the guidelines that were needed to create family dinner nights that were functional.
Yeah, yeah. And I also teach a structure which starts with discussing some positives first. And in the first few family discussions, just have positives, and then bring in just one problem that everyone agrees on they'd like to work on. If one person says it's not a problem, then it's off the table. But if they all agree on it, that it's a problem, then they work on it. So that type of structure. And then at the end, always set the next time and day for the next family discussion. Otherwise, it tends to get lost.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good addition to some of the structural things that I created there. The one that we both had as part of our structure is making sure that you set a new family dinner night time at the end of every single session, that you never have a time where that's not on the calendar. One of the other things is that step number 1, I find that's important, is no electronics at the table. And if you say, well, gee, my kids don't, they won't let me take the electronics away from them, then you have a hint, which is anytime you're saying that the kids, won't allow something to happen, then you're telling me that the children are in charge of you. You're not in charge of the children. And so spend some time with the boy crisis, looking at how how much leverage you have to be able to be a parent. One of the things that I discovered in interviewing boys and families is that boys, when they don't have structure, and this is true mostly of girls too, but when boys especially do not have structure, they are somewhat like a person walking on in the total dark on a let's say a piece of steel, which they can fall off. And they become very insecure about not knowing how far they can walk without falling off. As parents create structure for them, they feel a lot more secure, that they know where to walk and how far they can walk, and where they can play in an experiment with them. And so the power of creating structure and saying, no, this is family dinner nights, 1 hour and 30 minutes. During this hour and 30 minutes, there will be no electronics, and then following the procedures in the Boy Crisis book about what to do if your children fire back negatively about that. The other important thing that quickly creates a family dinner night being something that is looked forward to is that each person has a period of time to talk. And during that period of time that they talk, no one interrupts. And before we go on to the next person, a couple of people in the family say, so Jimmy, what I heard you say is this, and then is that completely accurate, what I heard you say? Did I distort anything? Did I miss anything? Is there anything that you want to add to that? And when Jimmy feels perfectly heard, no matter what his opinion is, if he's a neo-Nazi or the left-wing liberal who's in favor of, not having anybody look at a woman the wrong way without being arrested. These are two extremes, obviously. No matter what he or she says, the first job of the family member is not to sit there in negative disagreement, either in body language, but to be there totally trying to understand what he's saying or she's saying, where they're coming from, and what are the pieces of the puzzle that they put together that make their puzzle look like it makes sense to them. When boys and girls have that at a family dinner night, they have an experience of what I call e pluribus unum. Each one, e pluribus many, unum one, each one at the family dinner table feels that they are heard, that they are one, that they are individuals, that it can be different than anybody else and not be chastised for being different. And then that they are a family.
Okay, great. Those are great suggestions. I took notes. I will add some of those things to the family meetings. Unfortunately, Zoom will be cutting us off in a few minutes. So just to conclude, what is next for you? Do you have a project on the table, or you're writing another book on a related or unrelated topic?
I'm going to be doing a revision of The Myth of Male Power, which was a big book that has had a huge amount of impact, and but is 26 years of age. So that's my next project, immediate project. And then right after that, I've been doing couples communication workshops around the country. And so I'll probably do a book called Role Mate to Soulmate, and on the art and discipline of love. And that's couples communication workshops that I found to be probably more powerful and more successful than anything I do, because every couple walking in on Friday, almost every single couple walks out of the workshop on Sunday much more in love with each other, and then having the tools to be able to sustain that love.
Okay, great. That sounds wonderful. And thank you very much for joining us. This was very enlightening to me, and I'm sure to our viewers. And do you have a URL or anything else that you'd like to add?
My website is warrenfarrell.com. I couldn't remember anything more complex. And the Farrell is F as in Frank, ARRELL. And then if you're interested in the Boy Crisis book, Amazon has it right now at a 33% off sale.
Wonderful, wonderful, great. Thanks again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure talking with you, Michael.
Good, same here. If you had any comments, please comment below. Please give us a like, or maybe 2 likes, one for Warren and one for his book, The Boy Crisis, and subscribe to the REBT Advocates, and work on your rationality to stay on the rational side of life.